Georg Zachmann, the European Parliament is currently deciding whether or not to backload a current surplus in emissions allowances to fight a drop in prices under the EU's emissions trading scheme. But you've been arguing that the debate has become very politically charged and is not in fact offering any real solutions and putting forward real proposals to tackle the real crisis of credibility in the system.
Yeah, indeed. I think the discussion about backloading is largely overblown. There is a big issue for policymakers now to decide whether they would like to implement a measure that has no big economic meaning, because to be frank, backloading is just putting 900 million allowances from today to 2019-2020, which at a surplus of 2 billion allowances will not shift the demand-supply balance whatsoever in the system. What is striking about the current situation is that essentially the problem comes from overfulfillment of the targets. So we reduce the emissions in Europe more than we expected to do with the ETS. So therefore, we had a cap of 2 billion tons of CO2 in the year 2013, and actually much less emissions will be produced. So there are more allowances on the market because we were better than we thought before. The reason for that is that we have now had 4 years of economic crisis that have not been foreseen. We have had a lot of international mechanisms for reducing CO2 that were allowed to sell their additional carbon reductions to Europe, and other sources for additional allowances coming into the European system. The problem is that we have this oversupply of allowances in the system where market participants believe now those emission allowances are worth nothing, and therefore the price of those collapses. And this makes it that market participants think that maybe in the future the emission trading system is not the tool for reducing emissions in Europe anymore. And therefore we don't buy those allowances now in order to be able to in the future pollute. And as the price is so low, everybody says that maybe in the future reducing emissions will be not worthwhile, and therefore there are no investments in low carbon technology. So if you today have to decide between building a gas-fired power plant with comparatively low emissions compared to a coal-fired power plant, and if you just look into the coal price, the gas price, the electricity price, and the emission allowance price, you would say, I would directly go for a coal-fired power plant that is much more polluting.
Doesn't the current ETS and backloading debate, though, point to real flaws in the system?
I think the emission trading system itself is a very neatly designed system. So it has been established now a couple of years ago in 2005, and it has improved tremendously. It's now entering its third trading phase in 2013, and the European Commission got rid of a lot of the problems. They got rid of the fraud problems. They included new sectors in the system to improve coverage. They included new countries. They included new gases. They made the allocation of the allowances in the system much more fair and unbiased. They helped sectors that are at risk of carbon leakage, so at the risk that they would move outside to avoid the system. So the system is quite neatly designed, and it's even a very long-term tool, so it has no sunset clause. It is supposed to run beyond 2050.
So you're not worried about a surplus?
This in itself is, for me, not a problem, because what we know, as I said before, the system is to run indefinitely. So we will, in the overall emission trading system, have the right, under the current legislation, to emit about bit more than 50 billion tons of CO2 until the 2060s. And now 2 billion allowances of 50 billion overall is not so much. So you could just think that we now saved a bit more, because later on we will need these allowances to cover the higher needs for emissions in the future. So we might want to set some emission allowances aside currently by not emitting too much today, in order to be allowed in the future when emission allowances get really scarce, because we have potentially economic growth and the number of allowances in the system are set to decrease, that then we still have some sort of buffer. So if what economists call intertemporal arbitrage works, that is shifting over time the decisions on whether maybe today save something and in order to able to consume emissions in the future would work, then the price at the emission trading system would not be so close to zero. The obvious problem that we have is an issue of credibility. So market participants do not believe that the system as it is implemented today will exist still in 2050 in an unchanged form. So the problem that we are facing is that market participants see that there is a surplus of allowances, and they think this surplus of allowances points to an invalid demand-supply situation, so that there is not enough demand for those things. They don't see the future demand, they don't take this into account, because they believe that maybe in the future the emission trading system will change in a way that there is not such a big demand for those allowances.
Have there been discussions on any viable alternatives, though?
There is indeed a lot of discussion coming up every year on whether the ETS is a good tool and how it could be potentially replaced. There are discussions always about carbon taxes, just to replace the cap-and-trade system by a system where you just have a flat tax in Europe of, say, 20 euros per ton or 40 euros per ton or whatever. And people argue it gives much more visibility. I would disagree. I think the ETS, as it is designed currently, is really a very, very cleverly designed mechanism, because it allows to save emissions today and then to bring them to the future, bring those allowances to the future in order to be allowed to pollute more in the future. And the price pattern that develops really helps to reduce emissions at those point in time at which it is cheapest, in those countries where it is cheapest, in those sectors where it costs the least.
What are your suggestions for restoring credibility?
And there's all sorts of political possibilities to play around with the system. You can allow foreign carbon credits to enter the system that would then inflate the system, which happened before. You could include new sectors that are maybe over-allocated with allowances. You could change some of the allocation rules, as we currently see with the backloading discussion. And you could play around with the targets still. So it's very, very difficult to give investors that invest into assets that last for 40 or more years the visibility of a long-term carbon price, and even the visibility that the ETS is going to stay. And this is not only due to kind of commercial risks that are everywhere, but it's particularly true due to the fact that there are political risks. And those political risks no company can hedge against. So what we are proposing is that the state itself sells guarantees on a future carbon price to investors willing to invest today. So if you want to invest in a low carbon technology today, that only pays off if the carbon price is above a certain level. You buy such an insurance from the state, you pay money for this insurance, you essentially buy the credibility of the government, and therefore you can do your investment decision because you are hedged against any low carbon prices in the future that are due to political failures. What is nice about it is it wouldn't cost the state much, because it sells the insurances, it gets money from selling the insurances, and later on it can design the carbon policy in order that the carbon price is high enough to meet the target set in the insurance. And in addition, you have a huge exposure of the state to too low carbon prices. So everybody else in the industry sees that the governments will lose money if the carbon system collapses. So everybody believes that it will be very, very difficult politically to scrap the emission trading system. And by this commitment device, you essentially show to everybody that they can really bet on the emission trading system, because the government put money on the table that they will lose if they mess up with the ETS.